Evolutionary.org presents Evolutionary Hardcore Podcast with your co-hosts, Steve from the American Underground and Mobster from the UK Iron Den. Get ready for the most hardcore and underground info in the industry. And here we go. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6.
Morning, everyone. Evolutionary.org Hardcore Podcast coming your way. Episode 124. Paul Dillet. Stevesmi here in Da Mobster joining me. What's up, buddy?
All good. Nice and cold, mate. Let's we can warm the world up with our podcast.
Let's do it, guys. So today we're going to do Paul Dillet. Maybe a lot of you out there in the United States may have not heard of him. He was born in Montreal, Quebec. Is what I see here as his birth date. And, you know, the guy had amazing genetics. Mobster and I were talking about it either. Today he's in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. So he's definitely born and raised and living in Canada. Interesting little tidbit about him. He played in the Canadian Football League. And then he had such good genetics. And we've seen this with a few professional football players, American football players, who have played football, then have went on to get into bodybuilding. You don't see that as often as you would think because they make so much money playing in the NFL that for them, there's really no challenge to go into bodybuilding. But we see some guys, they have an appetite for it. They definitely have the genetics. So they'll transition from football to bodybuilding and they'll do extremely well. Compared to guys who are, say, going from baseball to bodybuilding, which you don't hear about, or basketball to bodybuilding, which you definitely don't hear about. So he definitely had those amazing genetics. So let me kind of get through. He's basically known in the 90s. He was a big guy in the 90s. NPC, North American Championships. He got second and first place in 91, 92. Mr. Olympia, 93. He got sixth place. Then the next year in 94, he improved to fourth place. And then he got fifth place in 96, 97, and 99. And in the Arnold Classic, he also had top 6 showings. His highest was third place in 1996. And then a Night of Champions, he actually won that one back in 1999. So the guy was he had a good run, especially in the mid to late 90s. And, we're going to talk about him in this podcast and what he went through during the 90s. And he's been very open today about his steroid use, which we're going to get into. That's going to be fun talk. And he's also been open about his feelings toward bodybuilding from the 90s to now. So we're going to talk about all that. I'm going to bring Mobster in here shortly. But first, let's talk about his stats, Mobster. Listed stats, 6'2", 330 pounds in his off season. Competition weight was in the high 200s, about 285. So he is a big guy.
Very big guy.
Yeah. So yeah, Mobster, I'll bring you in on this. There isn't that much about his early childhood, but we can kind of, get into what he's, his transition from childhood to bodybuilding.
I think in terms of his physique, one of the things that stood out in my mind when we were doing the background research, and obviously from the knowledge that I had of the guy already, is he one year at the Olympia, they had the guys coming up 3 steps and they were standing in silhouette in the O of Olympia as a stage thing. And his silhouette was right up there. He literally looked like a sort of Frankenstein freakish physique. You knew it was Paul. You knew from his shape, he didn't look like the other guys, and his genetics, which we'll get into, were stellar. They were just about as good as it's possible to be, because when we talk about his training, his attitude to training, his posing, his competitive career and whatever else, it's almost as though this guy did not know what he was doing and yet still looked like, as you say, late 200s. I'm going to go as high as 300 on stage at one point. He was an absolute, he looked like a laboratory experiment. That's how freakish he was. And when as I say, when we dig into the whys and whatever's of what made Paul Dillet as a physique star, it's almost just purely genetics that he ended up looking like the way that he did. He was an absolute monster. There's training stuff out there where you see him training, working with Charles Glass, and Charles has got him doing the stuff that he needs to do. But by reputation, Steve, it's almost like he didn't know, as me and you talked about in the pre-show. There's so many elements of what he was doing that should have made him one of the best bodybuilders in the world, which he was, where it almost seems kind of he needed a guru like we have now. He needed someone to hold his hand, because honestly, if he looked the way that he did and he wasn't maximizing his potential, you just go, what the hell? If you guys don't know him from the 90s, just Google image. This day was front page material, because he was just an out and out monster. We're not talking about tiny waist aesthetics here. It's just he's a and to put it crudely, he's a what the fuck kind of physique, Steve, honestly. Yeah.
Yeah. He is definitely a beast. And he did, we talked about this in the pre-show as well. Guys back then in the 90s, they didn't have access to what we have access now. They didn't have access to coaches that you could just FaceTime with or Zoom with online. They didn't have access to the forums, fitness forums. They didn't have access to all this information, podcasts like this. In those times, they had to just go by word of mouth. And we call it bro science. And that's what it is. In bro science, if you ever talk to someone in the gym about steroids or weight training or nutrition, you're going to hear a lot of bro science come out of their mouth, because they haven't basically got the access to what we have access to, Mobster and I, and what you guys have access to. Since you're listening to this podcast, obviously you guys are seeking out information. So in Paul Dillet's camp, he was in the same boat as some of these other guys, where he just, his peers, they just were clueless at that time. So we're going to kind of get into his steroid cycle, but, we have to get into what happened to him back in the 90s when he got basically a huge scare. So this happened back in 1994. I'll let Mobster talk about this, but I just want to bring it up. This was at the Arnold Classic, and in one of his poses, he froze on stage, and he had major problems from cramping, from water retention and dehydration. So he was drying himself out. He was probably taking not only drying steroids, which we're going to talk about later, but he was also taking diuretics, and diuretics were a big thing back then for them to dry out. So I'll bring in Mobster. He can talk a little bit about this. Go ahead, Mobster. Tell us a little bit more about this story.
Yeah, that's basically what's happened here. And there was a quick side thing that I actually recorded for another bodybuilder, which I think is what Paul's done. So not only is he coming in shape, he's one of his guys that 24, 48 hours. Sometimes when you're competing as a bodybuilder, to use a British euphemism, your head's not right on properly. So you don't see what everybody else can see. Everybody else can see this vascular, muscular freak that's probably going to kick ass in the competition. What's looking back in the mirror for Paul is I need to dry out some more, I need to dry out some more. So he's coming depleted, he's coming thirsty, dehydrated, and for some particular reason, he's only taken a tiny bit more than he should have done as far as your diuretics is concerned. He's come onto stage, the lights are drying you out some more, he's got that kind of physique. And as Steve says, he's got, it was described in the magazines and there were photographs, online videos at the time, as a whole body cramp. It was like a comedy, Steve. They picked him up, the guys on stage, and they took him off, and he looked like a cardboard cutout of a giant, where someone's got an arm and someone's got a leg, and he's not flop, he's not on a stretcher, he's kind of rigid. I believe one of the descriptions that was given at the time in a post-competition interview, he said that what really hurt being in that particular situation was that his spine, the muscles around his spine kind of locked up. So he was not only was he frozen solid, he was in quite a lot of pain. When they've got him off stage, one of the stories that's come out of this in more recent times, and was a headline on a particular another podcast, described as having a heart stoppage, vis-a-vis a heart attack, but described as his heart stopped backstage. And then obviously part of the problem when the guys did overdo the diuretics, if you're not completely honest with the dosage and the hospital is not familiar with what bodybuilders are doing, they can make a right mess of it at the hospital. Fortunately for him, that he was rehydrated, potassium levels were brought back, sodium levels were brought back, and he was able to recover. I do believe, and this is just from memory, he actually came back at some point in the evening, if only to sit in the audience and not back on stage. But yeah, for the audience, for people at the time, it was a hell of a shock. Looked really, really bad. When you had around the same time, Steve, as you'll know, Andreas Munzer and a couple of others where they died. They didn't. This was going to be the third one of around the same time, and bodybuilding was going to struggle anyway. But when you can potentially have 3 deaths on stage or 3 deaths because of diuretic use, etc., that's why we know that the diuretic tests were brought in at the same time. And Paul was, again, freak of nature, last-minute mistake, whole body cramp. That's just not a situation that bodybuilding wants or needs as far as the publicity is concerned. And it's just trying to do too much to bring in that extra condition. I've already said, I can't see this guy has ever been a Mr. Olympia because he just lacked that little bit of a polish, that little bit of a shape that the Mr. Olympia has to have. So really is doing an unnecessary risk to get that last little bit there. He was winning competitions. He was doing okay overseas in certain events, etc. He didn't really need to win the Mr. Olympia. In fact, in a recent interview, which I watched as part of the Back Show research, financially, in terms of sponsorship, I think he said it was at one point it was with Muscle Tech, and they actually was giving him 6 figures to come back and compete. So as far as supplement companies and contracts were concerned, he was doing well anyway. So he didn't really need to win the Mr. Olympia. He didn't really need to take these risks. So it's that kind of trying to do the last thing at the last minute. As Steve said, it's that lack of information. The research that we do for the show shows really that he was getting like 70s and 80s information for a 90s bodybuilder. He wasn't because of his genetics getting him so far. He wasn't doing the right thing. And when you're not doing the right thing with diuretics, guys, when you're already ripped and dry and dehydrated, the risk for a bodybuilder like him could have been death. That's how serious this stuff could have been, as it was a heart stoppage and spinal muscular craziness on stage and being taken off. Like, how embarrassing, never mind anything else. So it's just crazy stuff and unnecessary, not really needed. When we give you advice on the forums and on this podcast or whatever else, we want you on stage. We want you ripped and dry and in condition. We want what you want. We do not want you carried off on a stretcher. We do not want you ended up in ER. We want you in the best condition. We want you on stage kicking ass and taking titles and trophies and bringing home medals. Paul Dillet was right up the top of the physique at that time and still making these kind of mistakes. So that's not the way that you need to learn this kind of stuff, guys. Oh, Steve.
Yeah. So, Paul has been very open about his steroid use over time. So, we're going to get into that. Also, another thing he's been open about in interviews is the way that bodybuilding has changed from the 90s till now. And I think it was very interesting what he was saying. And this is something that, we can debate, for many, many podcasts. But what he basically was saying that back in the 90s, because they didn't have the access that all of you have today, like these bodybuilders now, they're on social media. You follow them on social media. If you want to see the Mr. Olympia, you pull up a YouTube video. If you want to see them working out, you pull up a YouTube video. Back in those days, if you wanted to see them work out, you had to go to the gym they were working out to watch them. If you wanted to see them compete, you had to go to the competition to watch them. It's not like it is today where people tape it and then put it on social media and boom, you can see the next day. Like you can pull up
minutes later.
Yeah.
Minutes.
Live. You can put live, exactly. They stream it live and all that stuff. So you have to kind of understand that. Some of you younger guys, it's hard for you guys to understand that because you grew up in a completely different time. But like when Mobster and I were growing up, I can remember like if I missed the football game, okay, I had an option. I could either record it with my VCR or I'd have to wait till the next day. I'd have to wait to watch it on ESPN the next day.
3 days. 3 days.
There was no DVR. So I had to actually watch it with my own eyes or I'd miss it. And there wasn't a way I could pull up YouTube or pull up the NFL, .com and look at the highlights. That didn't exist. So bodybuilding was even worse. So he talks about back in the 90s, they used to worship these guys. Like his underwear, he'd throw it into the crowd and people would be like, they go crazy to see
Pay
them.
for his shirts.
Now
Sorry, Steve, sitting at a seminar, and I told this Steve off air, I said, sitting at a seminar, he says, he was talking about the money that he made and how he could have made a certain amount of money doing the seminars 3 times a week when he was at his peak, and 150 seminars a year and all this kind of stuff. And the story I told Steve was, he says he was at one seminar, he's done a bit of training for the crowd and a bit of posing, and he's got a sweaty t-shirt on, and someone says, can I buy your sweaty t-shirt? That's the way that Paul describes it. And he says, the guy offered him $100, and immediately one of the other guys in the crowd says, I'll give you $150. They just literally the shirt off his back. So yeah, it was that kind of situation. I'm old enough and been older than Steve, where I would go to maybe 2-3 seminars a year, and we had to get these guys to come over from the States. It wasn't always properly advertised. It might be advertised in my gym, but there would be other gyms I wouldn't even know that they were going to. I'm waiting for these guys to turn up, sometimes in great competition condition, sometimes in good off-season condition, but sometimes not. And you're paying what seemed like a decent amount of money. The magazines you'd wait a month for. One of the descriptions just yesterday, watching another video completely, is you can have a response on Instagram from a professional Mr. Universe or Mr. Olympia or wherever else in minutes. We can watch the live podcast stuff now. So the way that this stuff was done was completely different. One of the things he said, to change the subject a little bit, Steve, is he's saying, and he's doing the whole thing of, everybody says got rose tinted spectacles when it comes to the past. He says that 90s bodybuilding was the peak, and bodybuilding isn't what it is. In fact, he's gone so far, Steve, as to say he thinks bodybuilding is dying. Now, I'd actually disagree with this, because the reason he's made that statement is A, the rose tinted spectacles I just referred to, and the second is that he's created a federation of his own. It's the WBFF, the World Beauty, Fitness and Fashion Federation. And essentially, he's a businessman. And from what I can work out, he's quite a good businessman. So his idea with the federation that he's created, and we've actually got one over here in the UK based in Ireland, which is very similar. It's the idea is that these people come in, they've got a vein on their arm, they've got a good set of abs, but they're also model worthy. And so in terms of what's more attractive to the mass market, it's not going to be a Paul Dillet type physique or a Dorian Yates type physique. It's going to be someone who looks good, is in shape. And in terms of the show that he's putting on, it's quite dramatic. There's, different kinds of music. The costumes are kind of crazy. Sometimes the lighting's very, very good, etc., etc. But as I said in the pre-show to Steve, that sounds to me like the Miss Universe. So what's he done? Has he created a new bodybuilding federation, or has he just created a vascular, in-shape Miss Universe, which is what I think he's done? So from a business point of view, it makes sense for him to turn around and say that bodybuilding is dead, because he wants to get more bums on his seats. He wants to attract more sponsors. Now, he's been running this federation up in Canada for a few years now, and they do okay. It certainly does Paul Dillet's checkbook well. But in terms of it being something that's going to take over bodybuilding, that hasn't happened. And I'm old enough with the history of the bodybuilding sport from the 1950s onwards, and my own particular focus from 1980 onwards. Sometimes people come in, they try to reinvent the wheel, but for some reason, we like the freaks. So that's why there's more classes in bodybuilding, and Paul Dillet's right on that point. But he hasn't quite taken over the world with his small Canadian federation that's got, if people are getting modeling contracts, we're not hearing their names in the media. We're not hearing of them becoming famous. So if they're paying their $500 and they can wear feathers on stage, good luck to them. If they're happy and if Paul's happy, good for them. But they haven't kicked bodybuilding to the curb, and bodybuilding hasn't died yet. So guys, if you want to get hench, if you want to have muscle, you're still good to go. Paul's got his opinion, I've got mine. I think we can agree with what's happened just recently, and the $400,000 that the Mr. Olympia is getting as a winner, that is not handing out $400,000 prizes, his federation on his competitions. But it is what it is. People want to do that, they can do that. If they want to do bodybuilding, they can do bodybuilding.
And if you guys want to check out his Instagram page, if you go to Paul Dillet's Instagram page, WBFF shows, he's got pictures of some, they're beautiful women, mostly females, it seems. And the guys that he has are ripped to the bone on his Instagram. So,
yeah.
Yeah,
There's a few guys.
They're out of our league,
Oh,
Mobster. The women are out of our league. So don't.
They're out of my league now.
Yeah, we're both.
I'm
You don't have the looks for that. Maybe my old podcast
anymore.
My old podcast host Trevor, that would even be out of his league, even out of his league. So for us, a couple ugly guys like that. Yeah.
If he weren't the promoter, he'd get no action.
Yeah. All right, guys. So let's kind of get into, before we get into the steroid cycle, why don't we do, Mobster, I'm going to talk about his nutrition a little bit. You can get into his workouts because his workouts are interesting.
I'll do the workouts for sure for that.
Yeah. So let me get into his nutrition. So Paul, he talks about his nutrition. He likes to keep it simple. For a guy with his genetics, he doesn't have to complicate things. He talks about nothing fancy, the typical rice, chicken, a few steaks here and there. He likes to drink a lot of shakes. That's perfect for someone on the go. He can kind of get in all his stuff on there. He talks about fish oil. He talks about fat burners. He talks about taking multivitamins. He talks about his diet being extremely strict, especially in his competition prep phase. And then we see with all these guys, they're a lot bigger in the off season. Their diet isn't as strict. Him being a Canadian, Canadians tend to eat a little healthier than Americans, not vastly healthier like you guys in Europe, Mobster, but they do eat generally healthier. So for him, a cheat meal wouldn't be, a cheat meal for an American. I'll put it that way. So it's not like he's going and getting Big Macs as his cheat meal, but for him, I'm sure, he had some cheat meals here and there, maybe some ice cream, maybe some cake or something like that here and there, but nothing too much. But he talks about, chicken, eggs, fish, steak. Those are his staple protein sources. Not a big shocker, with that. It's not that complicated, guys. As long as you don't put trash in your body leading up to the competition, you're going to come in shredded with these types of genetics and with all the stuff that he's on. So Mobster, very, very important workouts. You're not going to build muscle without working out. No, Tell us a little bit about his workouts because he's open about this as well.
Yeah. So of my time again, and these things are on YouTube, guys. You can check them out. He was in these Battle for the Olympia type videos that Mitsu was putting out back in the day. Mitsu Wakabi, I believe his name is, MOC videos, and you can see Paul training. He was described by a lot of critics as being a kind of lazy trainer, and when you watch him, I like the guys lifting the heavy weights. I mean, that's my strength background. So if a guy's doing 180-pound dumbbells, that's that'll do me. But Paul wasn't that kind of person at all. And in fact, the argument goes again, his genetics was so damn good, his response to training was so damn good that he could be kind of sloppy. So I believe there's videos on there. I think he goes up to 50-pound dumbbells. And you think, so this guy's 285 pounds, 290 pounds on stage, 330 pounds in the off season. You kind of expect him to be doing 400 and 500 pound benches. He's using 30, 40, 50 pound dumbbells for some of his exercises. And even the one I mentioned earlier on when he's training with Charles Glass, who was like the coach of the time, and even now is still highly rated. He's not doing what you see other bodybuilders at that time doing. He's not down in the cellar in a basement gym like Dorian. He's not with Flex and Chris and that and doing 450-pound benches, but he still looks a monster. So he was described, as I say, as a bit of a lazy trainer. His response to training was on par with just about no one else's in terms of what he was able to do with the lightweights he was using. However, there is an occasional reference where the guys say on a rare occasion that he pushed himself, on a rare occasion that for whatever reason, whether he was on the right dose of testosterone when someone was kicking his ass or whatever else, he was a moderately strong guy. But his response to training was so damn good, Steve, that 30-pound numbers, 40-pound, 50-pound numbers was enough for him to be sitting there at 300 pounds with 22-inch arms, vascular as hell, and looking like something from the Black Lagoon. He's just an absolute monster. He probably having what from old school bodybuilding, the Sergio Olivier response to training, that you could do practically 5-hour workouts and still look the way that he did. You could do 200 or 300 reps and still look the way he did. He could use 30-pound dumbbells when everybody else was using 100-pound dumbbells and still look the way that he did. So he was almost in spite of his training, an absolute freak, an absolute monster, and whatever else. It was kind of crazy in that particular way. And it's one of those things sometimes that the guys with those kind of genetics don't appreciate. When I'm reading yesterday an old bodybuilder magazine, and Sergio Olivier, pretty much for most of his life, had a 28-inch waist, regardless of his size, his shape, etc. Even he, in the article, talks about how I'm unusual. I think Paul's only now coming out of bodybuilding and moving on into different directions, realizes and appreciates just how rare his kind of genetics is and how his ability to respond to that kind of situation and have the look that he had was as good as it was. Steve?
All right, so let's get into the steroid cycle. So in some interviews, he did an interview with Tom Platz, which Mobster and I were, read through. And I thought it was very interesting. One of the cycles he talks about was using 400 milligrams of DECA per week with 400 milligrams of testosterone a week with one anadrol a day. That one anadrol would come out to 50 milligrams because that's what anadrol typically comes with, 50 milligram tab. So what was interesting about that is that that's like a cycle that's a second cycle or third cycle for most gym rats. And the fact that he's saying that's what he ran, that seems really, really low. So that was interesting that I found. Another thing that he talks about too is Primobolan. He loved Primobolan. And Mobster and I were talking about it in the pre-show. If you actually look at his steroids that he liked, DECA, Primobolan, these are steroids from the 70s. These are steroid cycles from the 70s. Guys now, they don't really use Primo as a base in their cycle, but they did back in those days because Primobolan, Arnold was legendary with Primobolan. He used to take 1 cc of Primobolan, which is 100 milligrams. And back then they got pharmacy grade Primobolan. They could get that, access that. He'd inject that every day. So it came out to about 700 milligrams a week of Primobolan. And that's what he would run. Primobolan, it's a mild steroid. It's a DHT derivative, so it does not aromatize into estrogen. It's one that you would take to kind of build a nice physique. It's not one that you would take like Tren that's going to blow you up. So I thought that was interesting that his steroid use kind of mimics what the guys in the 70s and the early 80s were using. He was kind of old school with his steroid cycles in the 90s versus now the way guys use steroids, which is way, way more than that. So I thought that was interesting. And he talks about it openly. He says that he would mix DECA with Primobolan, which is a pure anabolic at the same time. So he liked mixing the whole DECA Primobolan, which is a good mix because that DECA is a mild steroid, but it gives you more appetite, better mood. It'll give you some nice gains in the gym. And the Primobolan is a DHT derivative. So DECA and Primobolan as a stack are perfect together. And that's why guys in the 70s would use that stack and it would work out really, really good because the DHN from the DECA and the DHT from a Primobolan, it's like peanut butter and jelly. It goes together really, really good. So he talks about using Primobolan 500 to 600 milligrams of that a week in his interview. But then he talks about, how he used growth hormone as well. So he would say about 10 to 12 weeks, he started using growth hormone with that cycle. And he says that he would, and in here, he says he would start at 12 weeks out of his competition. And the HGH was really good because the HGH gave him some growth and it also boosts his IGF-1, especially in the off season to help him grow. And then the HGH is also really good for fat loss as well. So he started really pushing the HGH, I think more in the mid to late 90s, he started pushing the HGH and maybe some insulin with it. So one of the steroid cycles that, we see on the Evolutionary forum kind of stacks those together because when you stack the HGH and the insulin pre-meal, the HGH will cause a rise to your blood sugar. Then the insulin comes in and drops your blood sugar back down, gives you a nice partitioning effect so that he can eat his protein and that stuff gets shuttled into the muscle. So I think what happened is in the early 90s, he was sticking to more the Deca Primo route. Then as the 90s went on, he started talking to people. And I think he got more
Yes.
aggressive as the 90s went on, because if you see his
Yeah.
physique from the early 90s to late 90s, it started growing. So what we could speculate he did was a gram of test, 100 milligrams a day of the Winstrol. The Winstrol is going to dry you out. 120 milligrams of the maybe Anavar, that's going to dry you out. That's going to give you some nice pumps there, make you nice and vascular. And then the Primo, he loved Primo. I don't see him getting away from the Primo Mobster. I still think that he was messing around with the Primo even in the late 90s, but he was running a lot more of it. I could see him running 1.5 grams of Primo even a week, just to get an edge on his competition, trying to keep up with his competition. And I also see him, it wouldn't surprise me as well if he messed around with Deca, because I think guys, with Deca, they viewed Deca back then as a great steroid. Today, guys are like, oh my God, I don't want to run Deca. I don't want to get Deca dick. I don't want to run Deca. I don't want to blow it up. I don't want to run Deca. I want to get a nice physique. Is a very misunderstood steroid. And the reason guys today screw up with Deca is they're not doing what he did. They're not stacking a DHT derivative with it. They're running too much testosterone with it today, and they're bloating up. And that's what happens when you run tons of testosterone with Deca. You bloat up, and you get a crazy appetite. So back then they knew how to stack these steroids, oddly enough, better than a lot of guys know today. And he knew what he was doing just based on that bro science, just based on that word of mouth, just based on talking to other guys and trial and error. He knew what to run. I also think diuretics were a big part of his game. We know that from his incident. I don't see him getting away from it, because even in that incident, look at how he looked. And if it's going to help him look a certain way on stage, I don't see him getting away with it. I see him learning from his mistake. I see him being more careful with it, but I don't see him necessarily getting away from it, especially considering, he nailed some of these competitions closer to 99 and 2000 as we got into the 2000s. So that's my speculation on his cycle. I think he was more aggressive early on, Mobster. Deca, Primo Bolin, very conservative, maybe an anadrol here or there, just to give the cycle a kick. But then as the 90s went on, I think he had to keep up with his competition. He realized, I'm not going to place in the top 3, the top 5 of these competitions anymore unless I up my game. I got to add in a lot of HGH, which is what he talks about in the interview. I got to add in a little insulin as well to get that partitioning effect. It's got to happen. So, Mobster, I'm going to bring you in here. What do you think? What do you think about all this? What do you think he ran his steroid stack look like?
So, one of the things that you said in your point was that it was an Arnold type of steroid cycle. It really was. In fact, my thinking as soon as you said it looked like a cycle that Arnold had done with a little bit more of everything on the cycle. So, literally, when you said the test and the Deca and the Primo, it was like that's the sort of cycle we were discussing in previous podcasts about Arnold Schwarzenegger. Is that all he's done is added 100 to 200 milligrams to the doses. And that's very much what it looked like right there at the beginning. 100%. In fact, if you look at his physique, the HGH, he had that look, especially at the time, slightly less so now, with the thickened brow. The idea that I think it's the angromorphy, where the guys have too much growth hormone for all the time, and you end up with this kind of thick brow, kind of Frankenstein kind of look to your face. And if you look at Paul in shape back in the 90s, that's how he looked. So 100% agreeing with that stuff. And I also agree again, I think Steve's got on point here in terms of the changes to his physique and what was required. He started out with literally, there were some books. We were talking about Dan Duquesne and a few others. So that's where he's getting his information from in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. He's taken a template of the physique steroid cycles that was being used in the 70s and 80s, and he's upped the doses, and that's all he's done. And then as he's progressed, as he looks like he's going to do well, as he's winning this competition or placing high in that competition, he's starting to realize that to step up his game, and he's gone to California at this point, he's training with the guys that are around him with professional bodybuilders. They're probably having, gone over to the fire station and sat down and a bodybuilder's special and talked about what's going on. The other thing, Steve, was and I mentioned it in a pre-show, he lived with, I believe it was for up to 2 years, it might have been slightly less, Lee Priest. And Lee Priest has discussed at length that he, both himself specifically, and Paul as his rent buddy, his house sharer, flat sharer, they never used big amounts compared to some. So when he was with Lee, I think Lee has actually stated this, and again, as you said, quite openly, that they were using the same steroids. Lee Priest at 5'5", 220 pounds in his absolute best condition on stage, and he's living with the freak of freaks, Paul, 300 pounds, late 290s, 280s on stage, and they were both doing 300 milligrams in this and 200 milligrams in that. But what was happening, and I agree 100%, that they were starting to have these conversations with other people, and again, possibly towards the end of his career, with his crazy genetics, starting to have conversations with people like Chris Cormier, Flex Wheeler, and others at Gold's where he was training, and finding out their secrets, finding out how to get shape. I mean, again, as per right at the beginning of the podcast, when we talk about how he made the mistake with the diuretics, you don't need to learn that lesson more than once. You don't need to make that kind of crazy near-death experience more than once. So I think it's one of those things when you go, listen, this has got me so far, and I've got these crazy genetics, but I need to up my game. And but in this day and age, and it was just starting at the very end of his career, he needed to go sit down with not someone who knew anabolics and all the stuff that needs to get you into shape on stage, way better than him. And in fact, this is actually kind of true, Steve, of a lot of top professional bodybuilders, with one or two exceptions. Most of them, reason why they use gurus and that stuff, they're specifically competition gurus, is because the guru has actually sat down, if they're a good guru, and studied all the aerogenic, all the anabolics, all the stuff that gets you in the condition. The bodybuilder's just got great genetics that he can go kick ass in the gym. Tell me what to eat, tell me how to train, tell me what drugs to take. And I think Paul was there. He comes across as an intelligent businessman, but I think at the time, I'm going to be brutal, I don't think he knew what he was doing. I think he kept it real simple. And it's only, as you said, towards the end of his career that he learned what worked for him specifically, and how he could manipulate these things better. Something that I've never been keen on, but I know Steve knows a bit about this, with the guys with the kickstarters and the finishers, and changing mid-cycle as you're getting closer to a competition, what you keep in, what you take out, and so on. I don't think Paul knew any of that till very late in his career. Steve?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you bring that up, because I was going to bring up, he talks about in the interview, he talks about water-based steroids. So what he talks about is he'll stop the oil-based steroids 3 weeks out of his competition, and he'll switch to water-based steroids. And the reason he did that, maybe he didn't know why through trial and error, but the reason he does that is it makes sense, because he would use a suspension. He used the Winstrol Depot. These are water-based steroids. They're in and out of your body quick. So it gives you that flexibility of, I'm switching things out, in and out. They're in and out of my body. So if it's trial and error on the spot. So if something's not working, I look in the mirror, I flex. Something's not working, I can switch it out, switch something else in. It gives you that flexibility. But if you're on oil-based long injectables, you can't have that flexibility.
It's too long in the system.
It's too long. Primobolan has an N-8 ester. It's in your system 11, 12 days. Half-life is the half-life, which means that it's going to be in your system times 5. So you'll take the half-life of a steroid, multiply it times 5. So if it's 10, 11 days, that means that Primo is going to be in your system 50 days. What happens, Mobster, if he gets Primo and it's not really Primo? It's something else.
Exactly.
What if it's just testosterone that he's injecting? That will screw him up in competition. So this is why he realized, you know what? I got to make sure that in the 90s were the era, Mobster. I'm pretty sure you can confirm this, because you're over in Britain where steroids are legal to buy. But I'm sure you can confirm this, that the 90s were the era where guys went from using pharmacy grade gear. They switched more to underground, hey, my buddy in the gym has steroids for me to buy type of gear, because that's
very
what
much
happened.
so.
After the late 80s. I know in the United States in the late 80s, they, steroids really got hammered. So basically a lot of this pharmacy grade gear, they stopped producing it, and you couldn't get it. So I'm sure you can confirm that. So it makes sense
I can
that in this issue.
Yeah. I can give you a specific example here, Steve, that one of the guys that I'd actually got gear off way back in the day, as you say, late 90s for me, and he'd been around for a bit of time. They were getting the stuff in from Russia and Pakistan. We would buy, I think it was the Iraqi or Iranian test emphanate, the stuff that was coming in from Pakistan or wherever else. And this was pharmaceutical, and it was being smuggled from those countries into the UK. Actually, it was being brought in through customs, and a specific story for that. And they were just paying the VAT, the tax at the customs desk, and being brought into the country because of the way the laws in this country work. There was no limit to what you could bring in. So the custom officer gets all excited, and the guy that's got his suitcase full of drugs just say, how much do I need to pay on the VAT, the value added tax? So it would be brought, smuggled into the border and then just brought over to the border quite legally. And this was pharmaceutical quality product. It was Indian or Pakistani or Russian, but it was or Iranian, but it was pharmaceutical. Now, of course, as you say quite properly, there are labs here in the UK that are creating steroids. It swings and roundabouts. I think there's a lot of guys that argue about the idea of pharmaceutical versus UGL. UGL can, of course, be just as good as pharmaceutical in the right circumstances. But as Steve says, when you got pharmaceutical products, you knew that what you had was what it said on the label, 100%. Whereas with UGL, guys can quite often start really well and then cut corners and then put cheaper ingredients and different steroids into the bottles and so on and so forth. So it's that kind of situation. Price-wise, I remember paying at that particular time when I was just starting to get into steroids, I wanted to do everything properly, so I paid a small premium for essentially getting smuggled in, although legally at the border, pharmaceutical products. And it'd be, if a bottle over here was £30, then you were paying £35 or £40. So it was worth the extra £5 or £10. So the extra, as I say, 10 to 15 bucks extra to know that what you were getting was that particular way. So yeah, that's the kind of stuff. Again, I believe from Paul Dillet, there is some reference to say that he was getting pharmaceutical, and indeed he would have been at the end of the time when the guys could leave the gym and go down and see a local doctor in and around Venice Beach. That was just about finishing at the end of the time when he started to finish the end of his career. So the guys were getting checked and they were able to buy over the counter on prescription pharmaceutical steroids. It only towards the end of Paul's time that you talk this hearing about guys making up raws in their home or selling drugs out of the back of cars and that kind of stuff. It went on around that time, but when you're at Paul's level, you're hooked up. Here's the guy to go and see, here's his number, tell him I sent you, get your bloods done. And quite often, there's another thing I heard, there's rumor around the same time, Steve, was that there were certain doctors that were bodybuilding fans. So they would hook you up just to see a crazier physique on stage because that's what they liked. So these guys would send you stuff. That doesn't happen anymore because the FDA and DEA are not very keen on those kind of things. And for some reason, you could lose your license. But
it's like,
back in the day,
can you give me a strip show and I'll hook you up with a nice, I'll write you
I think there was a combination of factors at the time. So there was the muscle worship stuff, but these were for middle ranking guys. You go, take your shirt off and show us your chest and I'll give you some primo. That wasn't for the top guys. The top guys would literally be, if you pay this guy $100 over and above, you go down, he'll say your testosterone's low and he'll write you out a prescription. And as I said, the other thing was literally, if you're a Jay Cutler or a Paul Dillet, or if you're a very, it's kind of crazy, right? You get to be the Mr. Olympia by having these great genetics, there's a crazy work ethic, by being a businessman and a bodybuilder, by doing all the things that needs to be done. And then the higher up you go, the more likely they are to give you good drugs. And that's very much at that time where it was, you'd hear these crazy rumors about what was going on. One of the rumors around Dorian Yates, for example, was that people thought that he would go to bed hooked up to an IV with the amino acids and the drug going into his system overnight, which was just stupid. Literally, that stuff would have to be specifically made for him, and the machine would have to know exactly what he needed. It was an idea that sounded great, but in reality, it was cobblers. He was doing the same amount of drugs as everybody else, the same drugs as everybody else. The only thing is that you're more likely to get at that level offered pharmaceutical, whether it's the right doctor or whatever. There's still stuff out there. I think we had on the forum the other day, Steve, that story that one of the members put up about one of the suppliers on some forum being hooked up with some drug cartel in South America, and if you gave his name to the police, the drug cartel was going to come down and kick your ass and do very, very naughty things to your mum and your sisters and whatever. So it's just kind of crazy stuff. Reality of the situation is that when you get to the Miss Olympia level, there are fans that want you to kick ass. A big Ramy in the Middle East, he'd be probably falling over people offering him peptides and whatever right now, because they'll want him to go back and kick ass. I mean, one of the things from that time, Steve, especially certain countries with communist Russia and again to some degree the Middle East, is that you can be government sponsored. I mean, this is how the Russian athletes were doing well in the Olympics. So the higher up you are, to want of a better phrase, the better drugs you get. But I think, believe it or not, around that time in California, they were still able to hook up with a doctor and get prescriptions, and it would be pharmaceutical over-the-counter stuff, whether it was a compounding pharmacy or normal up-the-street pharmacy. After a while, of course, the FDA, the police, drug enforcement, everybody else realizes that there's these bodybuilders going to this one doctor in California and they're all getting their drugs in and going back to the gym and working out and doing whatever. That doesn't happen for very long, and eventually that kind of thing gets people arrested and charged and whatever else. And there was stuff like that going on at the time as well. When Dan Duquesne wrote about the bust that was actually down there and how doctors were losing their licenses and this kind of thing. So it doesn't last forever. But if there's a choice between pharmaceutical and UGL, people bite the hand off the person that's offering you pharmaceutical. And I think at that time, Paul would have been one of those guys getting that kind of level of drugs and quality of products and whatever else. As we say, the issue wasn't what drugs he was using. The issue was his lack of knowledge at the beginning of his professional career versus his knowledge improving as the information become more available. Steve and I, they had books that you had to read, and and even now, you and I, Steve, we know what's in those books, and we kind of laugh at some of the stuff that they were trying, and even then they were experimenting. Dan was experimenting with people, with some of the athletes he had. Fortunately for us, we've learned from those books, we learned from that information, we've learned from those mistakes. And of course, we understand with the blood tests and stuff like that, individual variation and what's going to be done. Pretty much the advice is always going to come down to, and if a Frankenstein like Paul can do it, it's going to come down to this: start low, work your way up. If you can turn into a 300-pound on-stage monster like Paul Dillet, with the doses that he was doing, which is a second or third cycle for a lot of guys now, then that's understanding you can become a monster with low dose if you've got genetics, but equally you don't need to be on grams and grams and grams. He was using a 70s steroid cycle to become a 90s bodybuilder, and look what he looked like. I swear to God, guys, go online and look what he looked like. It was an absolute. And Lee Priest at 5'5" had probably the best arms, arguably the best arms of all time, but certainly the best arms of his time at 5'5" and 220 pounds on stage, using next to nothing. I think Lee Priest is one of the few bodybuilders that's probably taken less than me, because I don't use much at all. So it's entirely possible to end up being an absolutely amazing bodybuilder with next to no drugs, and these guys are good examples. Some of you will require more informed dosages. Some of you need to vary. Some of you need to do what Steve said, which is use short acting instead of long acting, especially pre-competition. So yeah, there's a thing to learn from today, Steve. The idea of taking out the oils and the long acting and putting in the shorter acting stuff and making sure that you're clear of the long acting, that's for competitive bodybuilders, to have that last minute manipulation. What you don't want to do is play around with diuretics in the last 24 hours pre-show, I believe, if one story to be believed, in hours before going on stage. No. Steve, you know better than I do. Some diuretics take, I think it's a half-life of one, isn't it, 11 or 12 hours? So you're dehydrated on stage, having taken a diuretic that's still in your system while you're on stage, while you're sweating out the moisture, and ended up in ER with what sounds like a heart attack, as Paul did.
And you're already on stage too. You're already nervous. Your heart rate's already up.
Oh yeah. Everything
your adrenaline is already sky high. So you combine all those factors. That's the place where you're going to faint and have a stroke. That's the place, because you're already nervous as hell. I mean, anyone who's been on stage, competing in bodybuilding, doing theater, doing a speech, in college, doing a speech in front of a bunch of people. I mean, it's nerve-wracking, Yeah. So already, so you can imagine what you went through. So Yeah, guys, it's really, really cool.
I've been on stage, not as a bodybuilder, Steve, but I've done a lifting exhibition for I think EFBB South Coast qualifier. And the guy that was running the competition said, come down, set up your stand for your little company, but I need you to go on stage. And it was definitely the deer in the headlights. You get on stage, and I'm just dressed like, sports gear to lift a weight, and the lights in your face, it feels like 500 degrees. It's not, but that's your nerves and your adrenaline. There's 500 people watching me lift a dumbbell off the floor. And yeah, and I'm not even in bodybuilder. I'm not ripped. I'm not tired. I'm not
You screw up.
Casual.
Yeah.
I'm like, what the hell? I can't see no one. But
if you try to do the lift and you can't do the lift, you're like pushing back. Everyone's gonna be like,
I made some mistakes because I'd done the damn lift I was supposed to be doing in front of the crowd. I'd done it for guys 3 times in the daytime. Really, should have saved it for the show in the evening, but I had to now do it when I'm tired. And I'm drinking Coca-Cola, as you said, with caffeine, my heart going, and it's 10 o'clock at night. What the hell? And I'm not even in my underpants covered in baby oil. I'm just like up there in my sports casual or whatever. So, yeah, when you're like that, the guys are hungry, they're carb depleted, they're in condition. It's been said about bodybuilding at its best is when you're actually in the worst kind of physical fitness type shape. Being ripped at 3% or less is not healthy. Being on stage, sucking your gut in, holding your muscles for half an hour or an hour in a quote unquote relaxed position, which is not relaxed, and then posing, and you've made the mistake of slightly overdoing the diuretics, how he could have died. Simply put, he could have died, and he kind of screwed up. And that's the controversial thing about Paul. He could have died on stage in front of the crowd. The 2 other guys that died because of diuretic use were not on stage. He ends up being taken off, as I said at the beginning of the podcast, stiff as a plank, carried off by 4 of the exhibition guys, the backstage guys. He could have literally dropped down dead of a heart attack with a full body cramp in front of a crowd of 1,000 people. And that would have been probably just about the worst possible thing that could have happened to bodybuilding at the time. And can you imagine the reaction, the response of the media, Steve, if that had happened? So you learn, guys, you learn. Don't get someone else to look you up. If you're in condition, you're in condition. Doing last minute crazy stuff when you kind of ill-informed anyway as to what was right, what was wrong from his own perspective and from the information that we know about his cycles, etc. It's just crazy dangerous, and it could have been absolutely the worst thing that had ever happened to bodybuilding in the 90s. Dying on stage is just about as bad as it gets. So yeah, but on the other hand, I've said, an absolute freak is one of those guys. If you're not overdone on aesthetics, you go, hell, I'd like to look like that. I'd like to look like that and be strong, maybe not, lifting the kind of weights he was, more weights, but what the hell? I'm not going to complain with my 22-inch arms and covered in veins and looking like I'm on growth hormone 24/7 without being that way. So yeah, in terms of how he looked, he was an absolute freak, and there's always going to be a market for freaks in bodybuilding, Steve. There's always going to be he was on a couple of front covers. It's not going to sell a lot of magazines, but he still made the covers. So, if you're a fan of bodybuilding, you have the kind of body type that you like. He wasn't as marketable as he could have been, but he still made a hell of an impression in terms of how he looked. Check him up, guys. Have a look online and see what this guy looked like. He's going to be, damn, oh my God. Maybe not your kind of thing, but it'll probably get you the down 2-3 reps in the gym. So see how you feel. Steve.
All right, guys, we're out of time. This was episode 124, Paul Dillet. Hope you guys enjoyed it. For Stevesmi and Da Mobster, we will talk to you guys next week with another person. It's going to be a secret. We will. You'll have to wait to find out. Take care, guys. Take care, Mob.
See you soon. Ta-da.